Cybersecurity Leadership Triad. And with us today, we have Joe Sullivan, Kevin Garvey, and Lance Spitzner, who over the past 3 weeks have been talking with us about different components of the hack and how it could have been prevented. Today, they will come back and talk all together on how all of these 3 courses of SANS work together for the best transformational cybersecurity leadership you can have. Please put your questions in the Q&A and we will answer them at the end all together. And now I shall turn it over to Joe. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. So hopefully you've attended all the previous webcasts in the Rekt series. If you didn't, you missed out. You're going to be kind of lost as we tie all this together here at the end. What we're doing here is we had 3 previous webinars. We had the strategic approach from Management 514. Then we have the security leadership approach from Management 512. And then we led it up with Management 521 on security culture and leading change. And that was with Kevin Garvey and Lance Spitzner. So we're going to get into this last part and talk about how we can tie all this together, how each course complements the other one as you build your information security program. And okay, you're at the next slide. Cool. Okay, I know where we're at now. Sorry. So I'll be going first. Joe Sullivan, that's me. I've been in information security for 20 years. Doing various different things, started in the late 90s, incident response, penetration testing, things like that. And I'll let Kevin and Lance introduce themselves here as well.
Sure, thanks, Joe. My name is Kevin Garvey. I teach Management 512 and been teaching Management 512 over the last few years. I was drawn into the SANS program way back when I first started taking some SANS courses, and I knew I wanted to be a little bit more involved. My day-to-day, I am a security manager, and I am in charge of security operations, which includes vulnerability management, security operations center, threat intelligence, incident response, and for those who are in the industry, a few myriad of other security operations items as well, which we'll start talking about when we start talking about Management 512. Off to you, Lance.
Oh, all right. Hey, thanks, guys. So my name's Lance Spitzner. I'm a director at SANS Security Awareness. I've been an instructor at SANS for about 20 years now. First 10 years or so were highly technical. So if anybody wants to geek out afterwards, happy to geek out. However, the past 10 years, I've been really focused on the human management leadership side. I'm really excited to be part of the management team, and I'll be providing the perspective on Management 521, security culture. Joe, back to you.
All right. Thanks, Lance. Just to get you up to speed, Rekt Casino is a fictitious organization in Las Vegas. It's a casino, obviously. And what happened was they had a very immature security program. No compliance, no security awareness, a small IT team responsible for security. Some malware came in over email, was ransomware. They clicked the link, encrypted all the files. They had a data breach, data got out, and it got really bad. They didn't have any threat intelligence. If they would have at least had that, they would have known that this is an issue they should be aware of from a security perspective, because the casino literally up the road had already been compromised by a nation state. So it was basically a dumpster fire at Rekt Casino. We can go to the next slide here, Laura. So this slide is a good visualization of what you end up with when you don't have that foundation for Management 512, the technology aspect, or the strategy perspective of Management 514, or how to build a security-based culture based on Management 521. You need the leadership and the technical acumen to better understand how to appropriately prepare the strategic plan for information security. Once you have all that, you can implement the strategic plan, and implementing the strategic plan means a lot of change. You need to learn how to lead and manage that change. This is where the Transformational Cybersecurity Leader triad of Management 512, Management 514, and Management 520 or 521 sets you up for success. Did I get that right? 521, Lance? Okay,
you got it.
The numbers interchange. We're too close, 512 and 521. So the first part, go to the next slide, Laura. Cool, we're there. The first part, oh, back up one. Sorry. The first part is a strategic perspective for Management 514 and how it ties back to Management 512 and Management 521. In Management 514, we talk about the holistic approach to security. That means we don't focus entirely on one aspect. Similarly, as you make the transition from security technologist to security leadership, you can't focus on just one aspect. You can't focus on strategy alone or leadership alone or culture alone, right? You need a well-rounded approach to doing this. Let's go to the next slide. In my presentation on Rekt Casino from the strategy perspective, I talked about how we need to understand the organizational history, and we had this mapped out right here. The green line is technology and how it's evolved from 1995 to 2015. And the red line at the top is how the threats have evolved over the same time period. The blue line at the bottom is what Rekt Casino had and had invested in over time from 2000 to 2015 and beyond: email, antivirus, firewall, and VPN. Had they at least been exposed to Management 512, that blue line might look a lot different. We might see security awareness program, security framework implementations, governance risk and compliance, maybe a steering committee of some sort. But they didn't have that, and that's how they ended up in the position they were in. We can go on to the next slide. Also talked about how mapping to strategic objectives helps you show the business leaders how security contributes to the strategic business objectives of the organization. The bottom line is what security does. This is what we do from a security perspective: learning and growth of security capability. Everything we do affects business processes, which in turn affects customer stakeholder satisfaction, which in turn has a financial impact. If we don't have, or we don't understand at least vulnerability management, we don't understand how to analyze risk or how to manage security projects, we're going to be hard pressed to understand and explain how security contributes to those business objectives. And those are discussed in Management 512, and you get into leading change for Management 521. Next slide. In Rekt Casino, there was no understanding of security framework, strategic planning, or enacting and leading change. So on this slide, we have the CIS controls and the NIST cybersecurity framework and its 5 functions. Then you have the CMMI, the capability maturity model, here in the center underneath both these frameworks. These are really important, and we talk about them in Management 512 and Management 514. The reason for that is you need to understand what these consist of, but you also need to understand how to apply these in context with the varying degrees of organizational maturity that you're going to run into in different organizations or within your organization. Management 514 helps you implement this from a strategic perspective, but you also have to manage the change that goes along with those. And this is where Management 521 comes in. There's an art and science into leading and managing change. You can't do it with a brute force approach. You have to do it gradually. And there's kind of a marketing aspect that goes along with this, influencing people to adapt to that change. Management 521 is critical for getting this going. Next slide, please. Measuring maturity. This is a slide we talked about in my presentation. We have the 5 functions of the NIST cybersecurity framework on the left-hand side: identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. At the bottom, we have the 5 levels of the maturity model, 0 through 5. In order to progress maturity, you need to understand how to operationalize and become functional in these 5 areas of the NIST cybersecurity framework. Management 512 gets into vulnerability management. That would be good for the identify function, host-based security, how to protect endpoints, how to leverage a SIEM to detect incidents and intrusions, what incident response is, and how to operationalize around the PICRO model: prepare, identify, contain, eradicate, recovery, and lessons learned. Then you get into contingency planning in Management 512 as well. Without Management 512, you can't really push forward maturity with just a strategic approach. You need to understand what you're doing and how to get there. Next slide, please. Security isn't all about technical controls. Policy as a preventive administrative control can be just as effective in some situations. Policy establishes the bounds of acceptable behavior, which contributes to the overall security of the organization. Rekt Casino didn't have those policies in place. The bounds of acceptable behavior weren't established, right? You can't blame an end user for clicking on a link and downloading ransomware in that case. This goes back to creating a security culture that's covered in Management 521. Next slide, please. So policy. In Management 514, we talk about how security cannot be treated as an IT issue anymore. It's enterprise risk management. Policy ties together the entire enterprise risk management approach for the organization. It's not just technical controls and administrative controls. You have to consider compliance, regulations, contractual obligations, SLAs, and risk, how that impacts all these other areas outside of security. All this requires a technical background and a strategic background. And you have to understand how to lead and manage your culture as you contribute to this enterprise risk management approach that you're growing in your organization. Next slide, please. Delivering on the program. This was a slide I talked about Management 514, where we get into metrics and the 5 functions of the NIST cybersecurity framework, how we're driving those forward and making improvements, and how do we communicate how our security program is benefiting the organization. Delivering on a program takes a combination of everything you're going to learn in Management 512, Management 514, and 521. This is where you're stepping out of the orchestra and becoming the conductor, right? You need the technical aspect to develop the 5 functions of the NIST CSF, as you see on the left-hand slide, but you also need to understand how to develop and communicate metrics to the appropriate audiences that we discussed in Management 514. And you need that security-aware culture that makes everyone understand how they contribute to the overall security of the organization that we talk about in Management 521. Next slide, please. Ultimately, we can't make all this go forward if we don't raise awareness of what we're doing in information security. We need to market for security because we're competing with other organizations for time, budget, and attention. We need to build our brand, make our constituents aware of what products and services we offer and what our capabilities are. That gets into building culture, right? Making them aware that I can go to security and get secure email or secure cloud storage and share all this out. And that culture helps build your employee retention and your relationships with your constituents and other organizations. And I will hand that over to Kevin from this point.
Hey, thanks so much, Joe. And I love listening to the perspective of 514, because when I have students in 512, some of them have already taken 514 and they've learned the great strategies within 514. And now in 512, we're pulling it all together and we're going to operationalize all of the different things that Joe talked about. We're also going to operationalize things that Lance is going to talk about with security awareness. So, Lauren, we'll go into the security framework. And I know that Joe talked a lot about the security framework, but as we take a step back and think about that, why is that? Well, it's because the security framework builds up the story of your program. And in 512, we start talking about control, program, and risk frameworks. And why do we talk about it? Not only on day one, but in that order? Well, it's the cornerstone of you being a successful leader within security. And it's also a great way of showcasing how you can operationalize everything that we're going to be talking about in Management 512. And when I love having the students come to class who have taken SANS Management 514 in the past, they already come in with a great sense of why the frameworks are so important. But again, we talk about it on day one because it's such a big cornerstone for all of the success that a manager has within your organization. Or if we don't mind going to the next slide. Security awareness is something that all of us are going to talk about on the call today. And again, you might be thinking, why is that? Well, from the management perspective, what I love about security awareness is that we're bringing folks outside of our team to be part of our team. So we put on our security awareness hat and we look at not just the security operations team, not just a governance, risk, and compliance team, but everybody within the organization, HR, IT, and we bring them in because they're just as important to protecting an organization as everything that we're learning about in SANS. And Lance is going to go into some great detail about how we start driving security awareness, not only in his 2-day course, Management 433, but also with Management 521. And as we started talking about it in my last podcast or conversation, we started talking about what were some of the downfalls of security awareness for Rekt Casino. And one of them was maybe they didn't bring in the right folks to have a conversation about security awareness. Maybe when the program was being built up, it was only within IT. But We talk about that in Management 512 because we don't just want IT to be part of security awareness. We want so many other functional areas. But that could be hard sometimes, right? And that's what I love about Management 521 is we start figuring out how do we get past that art of bringing in folks into our fold to start working for us when they technically don't have a dotted line over to us. And leading that culture and leading that change really is one of the cornerstones of success for your security program, especially as you operationalize it as a leader. Next slide, please. The vulnerability management program really does a great job of bringing in everything from 514 and also 521. And we operationalize it in Management 512. What I tell my students in Management 512 is this is a great opportunity for you to really reach out to other folks in other organizations. And I think back to a lot of my experience with vulnerability management. It's certainly not done in a vacuum, right? You have to bring in the business owner. I have to bring in the remediation owners, the infrastructure owners, potentially even a customer, in order to make sure that the vulnerability management program that I have and that I'm running is as effective as possible. And we could do that through prioritizing some of the vulnerabilities that come through. One thing that comes to mind is Rekt Casino and how ransomware hit the environment. Well, it's one of those it depends type questions that I could ask. Would Rekt Casino have gone through this ransomware incident if they had prioritized the vulnerabilities? And in particular, maybe the one that had this ransomware variant attached to it. The answer is it depends, but there's a really good synopsis here that could state, hey, if we were to have prioritized that, we would have maybe mitigated the risk of this ransomware. And how do we help support that? Well, I go back to Management 514. In 514, we're building up the documentation, we're building up the policies, the guidelines, and even the desktop procedures to make sure that the vulnerability management program is as sound and successful as possible. But then I go back over to Management 521. I can't just tell somebody within a remediation team, hey, you've got 30,000 vulnerabilities that you need to fix up. Well, they're probably going to get overwhelmed along the way. However, if they feel that they're part of our team and they're helping out the security culture, what we're operationalizing, there's a better chance that they might be able to help us out along the way. Next slide, please. One way that we attest to the controls that we've put into place, not just on day one of Management 512, but for many days within Management 514, is through endpoint detection. And we could utilize some of the endpoint detection tools as our technical control. I know Joe talked a little bit about technical controls. It's such an important part of a program. We could do all we can to change that culture. We could do everything correct to have the right documentation in place. But hey, let's go back to Rekt Casino and think about, not only did they not have the culture in place, they didn't even have some of the documentation in place, but they didn't have some of the key endpoint detection or technical controls either in place or effective. And as somebody who's a manager in Manager 512 and you're taking the course, we have to learn not only the technicals that Joe was talking about, not just the strategic areas, but then we're also going to figure out how to operationalize some of these technical controls along the way. And the three tools that we have on the screen are just three examples of endpoint detection tools in tool sets that every manager would have in their tool set as they start operationalizing the program. And I think Rekt would have had a really much better way of responding to this ransomware incident if they had some of even the most basic endpoint detection tools in place. Laura, next slide. And lastly, we start talking about incident response. I love talking about incident response because it brings out the geek in me, and I had a lot of fun doing incident response type jobs and also requirements when I was not only building up the program, but also responding to incidents along the way. And there are many great SANS courses that have incident responses, the thematic for the 5 days. I took a great one, Forensics 500 a few years ago, and I walked out with such an amount of great information from that incident response course. But why do I bring that up? Well, in Management 512, we have to operationalize that. And when I tell my students at the end of going over incident response, what is one of some of the most important parts? Well, it's the lessons learned, because you go through an incident and during that incident, you bring in your technical acumen, you bring in all of the strategic acumen that you had and learned about it in 514. And now we have to figure out how we don't have an incident like that either happen again or reduce that risk. Now I think back to Rekt Casino, I think, well, they went through a really tough and rough incident. Do they want to go through that again? Well, they probably don't. And if I was somebody who was at Rekt Casino, not only would I want to know how to operationalize my incident response program, but I want to know, hey, what documentation do I need to put into place as part of that policy pyramid and documentation period to make sure that I have the right controls in place and that framework in place as well. But then as I operationalize it, for those who have worked on incidents, you have to bring in many other folks within an organization. It's not just IT security, it's infrastructure, it's potentially the business. It could even be upper management, and many times it is upper management. And your mind's probably going off, well, how do I make sure that they're aware of what to do? And how do I make sure that they know it's incredibly important? Well, in Management 521, you learn about how to really hone in on that culture within your organization, not just from a security awareness standpoint, but making sure that they're part of your organization. And it ultimately will make you more successful as you start growing within your security operations career. And with that, let me hand it over to Lance to go over Management 521.
All right. Hey, thanks, Kevin. Thanks, Joe. All right, folks, we'll keep this short, fun, and informal. One of the key things here is Management 521, what I call the security culture course, is all about the people side. So Joe and Kevin have been showing these different frameworks, models, the triad, people, technology, and process. Well, how do we handle the people side? What do we mean by people and culture? And that's what we're going to be talking about here very briefly. As I mentioned, I spent 10 plus years on the tech side, but at some point I saw we can just continue and invest in technology like Kevin and Joe are talking about. But if we're not also addressing the human side, we're going to continue to fail. So this is kind of like the glue that holds everything else together. So first and foremost, yes, you could say people are the weakest link, but I actually prefer people are the primary attack vector. And the reason why is in some ways we're getting so good at using technology to secure technology that we're literally driving the bad guy to start targeting people also. So this is one of the reasons why the people side is so important. We have to address the human OS now that we're getting really good at securing Windows OS, Linux OS, things like that. So if you could, Laura, the next slide. And this is a great way to visualize it. Look at everything we've done in the past 20 years to secure the Windows operating system. 20 years ago, it was really, really easy to hack Windows. I know when I was running the Honeynet Project, it took 3 hours for the average Windows computer to get hacked. Nowadays, weeks, months, if not years. That is until you involve the human side. But why is that? Because we've done comparatively very little to secure the human side or the human OS. So I would literally say we're driving bad guys to target people because we're getting so good at tech. That's why I don't like saying human is the weakest link. That suggests it's their fault. I prefer their humans are the primary attack vector, suggesting we may be part of the problem. All right, so next slide here, we see, so Lance, what is the solution? And this is where security culture comes in Management 521. Like I said, it's really the glue, what Joe and Kevin were talking about. In fact, this very class was inspired by Management 514. I remember teaching it and thinking about all the human sides and going, wow, it would be great to extend all of these strategic initiatives, but from the human perspective. And that's what this class is all about. So what is culture? Culture are people's attitudes, perceptions, and beliefs. Like an iceberg, culture can be hard to move, but like an iceberg, culture can be hard to also see. So when we talk about people's attitudes, perceptions, and beliefs, what does that mean from a security perspective? And why do we care? So next slide, Laura. So what happens is, what does a security culture even look like? A good security culture. Everyone says, we need a strong security culture. What does that mean? Here's different examples of what a strong security culture can look like. Now, you can read, I'll let you read them, but my favorite one is the first bullet point. People feel safe reporting an incident, even if they caused it. So in Rekt, Was it in an individual that goes, ooh, I just got a ransom notice, and then they reported it? Or does Rekt have a bad security culture and goes, ooh, I got a notice, got to pay a ransom? I'll just pay the $100 so nobody knows I screwed up. You can have the best tech and the best processes in the world, but if people don't know them, if people can't follow them, or people don't want to follow them because you have a very punitive security culture, we're going to continue to have problems. So these are the indicators that you have a good, strong security culture. But why? Why do we want this? Because, next slide, you'll see here, is if you don't have a strong security culture, you're going to have a vulnerable workforce. But also, to Kevin's point, Kevin was talking about, things like vulnerability management, incident response, EDR rollout, or maybe cloud, or maybe DevSecOps. That all involves a strong security culture. If the IT admins hate the security team, you're really going to struggle with your vulnerability management rollout. If operations hates the security team, you're going to have a problem with the EDR rollout. A strong security culture not only enables a secure workforce, but more effective security initiatives like Joe and Kevin were talking about. Problem was, in the case of Rekt, they literally had no security culture. We did a survey of Rekt after the incident, and we found out people didn't even know security was part of their job. They didn't even know there was a security team, security processes, policies, procedures, because the security team or the team at Rekt never did any outreach, engagement, or interaction with the workforce. So the good news is they did not have a bad security culture. The bad news is because they had no security culture at all. So that's one of the reasons Rekt was so vulnerable and fell victim to a ransomware attack. People had no training, no awareness, no understanding. Security was part of their responsibility. There was no glue to hold this all together. So what can we do about that? Well, as we see here in the next slide, one of the great things is in 521, we take an entire field of research known as organizational change. So in cybersecurity, as we just saw with Kevin, cybersecurity has all sorts of different frameworks. We've got NIST, we got critical controls, ISO 27000, pick and choose. Same thing in the world of culture, organizational change, change management. There are decades and decades of research on how to build more innovative cultures, safe cultures, efficient cultures. We take those lessons learned, those frameworks and models, apply some real world lessons learned, and create a model where you can build a strong security culture so your security strategy and your security technology initiatives are more likely to succeed. And that's all about motivating and enabling people. And how can we do that from a cybersecurity perspective? Kevin was talking about that when he was talking about awareness programs in Management 512. So to do both motivation and ability, quite simple. In the next slide, you see something called the Golden Circle, developed by Simon Sinek. He's got an awesome 17-minute TED Talk video on YouTube. Just look up Golden Circle, if nothing else, for 7 minutes. And he goes into the most innovative leaders, the most engaging, successful companies, the most effective marketing programs. They all have something in common. They always start with why, not what you should do, not how you should do it, but why. So one of the things we need to do with Rekt is when we start rolling out all these security initiatives and adopting these frameworks is first communicate to the workforce why this is important, why they're going to benefit, why we're doing this. If people believe and buy in the why, the what and the how just easily follows. In addition, next slide, please. We've been talking a lot about policy, process, and procedure. Joe is talking about how this is the foundation of applying your strategy. Your policies are in many ways taking your security strategy and putting it in writing. In fact, I stole this class, blatantly stole it from Joe's 514. It's one of my favorite. But quite often, organizations don't fail because they don't have policies. Quite often, they do have policies. The problem is people either don't know it, don't understand them, or can't follow them. So, a big part of a strong security culture is taking your policies, processes, and procedures and making them as easy as possible and communicating them as clearly as possible. A huge part of security culture is simplifying security. And that's actually really, really hard to do because you and I, security is simple. We live and breathe the technology every day. But for most of the world, security is confusing, intimidating, and scary. It's called curse of knowledge. So we take a step back. How can we simplify it? So when we do our security initiatives, like Kevin says, or we build those security strategies like Joe was talking about, how do we communicate? How do we simplify so people can easily do them? The easier we make a behavior, the simpler the policy, the more likely people will follow and exhibit them. So, culture at the most fundamental level is all about motivating and engaging, but also simplifying and enabling. And you do that in all of your initiatives. Security culture is not doing just one big single culture initiative and poof, it's done. Moving that iceberg involves applying motivation and ability to all of those initiatives Kevin just talked about, to building that strategic strategy that Joe was just talking about. And basically, it's how you interact with your workforce. All right, Laura, if we could wrap it up. So, building a strong security culture is really the glue that holds things together. When things get tough, when things get crazy, when there's an incident, a strong security culture will help everyone get through it together. When there's crisis, when there's change, like COVID, and you've got a weak or toxic security culture, you could have the best strategy in the world and things are still going to fall apart. So, like I said, think of security culture as the glue that enables both the strategy and the technology to be successful. All right, Laura, let's go ahead and wrap things up. Or I should say, Joe.
So we do have a couple of questions. Before we get to those final two slides, we will dive into the questions. Ideas for getting small business management to understand and agree with the need for developing a security program, going beyond IT setting up a firewall, encryption, and patching. Perhaps those with plausible deniability rules mindset.
I'll take that one. One of the things we talk about in Management 514 is using industry standard approaches like the CIS controls or the NIST cybersecurity framework. If you follow those, these are the industry standard approaches that you should be doing, you'd start to developing all aspects of your security program and you don't get hyper focused on one. A couple other things you can do is that maturity model I showed you where we're measuring maturity. That yellow line in the middle, this is where the industry's at. You can say, this is what our competitors are doing. Here's what we're not doing. We're underinvested in this particular area. And that'll help you get their attention as well.
Just to follow up what Joe said, peer pressure. Hey, our peers are doing this and we're not. But I love how Joe brought up the critical controls too, because sometimes leadership can go, ooh, this is really confusing. It's overwhelming. We can't do all of this. And then like Joe said, look, here's the critical controls. It says step by step what to do. This is a lot simpler than we may think it is.
And Lance, to end on that as well, I was working with an SMB very early on in my career. And one thing I quickly found out is they really face the exact same threats that a large organization does as well. And don't be afraid of asking for outside help. And something I bring up in Management 512 as well, maybe there is a MSSP or a managed security service provider that might be able to help you out in order to pull in some of those things that maybe there is no time or there aren't the right resources in that smaller organization to help out with. So going back to the question, you'll be bypassing just having a firewall but you'd be getting some expert help as well. So an important thing is, know when to ask for help. And obviously that requires resources and time, but it's always a good thing to at least bandy around as the discussion goes on.
Great. And a follow-up question to that, how do we get a good baseline of where our industry peers are at in the maturity model?
That's a really difficult question to answer. You can't go to one source and find this, right? You can pay consulting agencies to get that information. What I recommend is going to like the OWASP meetings or the InfraGard meetings or conferences and talking to these other individuals in your industry and have those, those side channel conversations. Hey, well, how's it going? What are you doing over here? That's probably the least expensive approach for getting that.
And Joe, to add on that as well, know that many organizations, Lance, yourself, and myself have talked about these frameworks, right? We're all working toward very similar frameworks. So if you want to base it on what many other companies may or may not be doing, there's a fair possibility that the frameworks that we talk about in 512 and also 514 is what many other organizations are working to as well. We also delve into how to prioritize that along the way in Management 512 and in 514.
And one other thing too is you may want to start with the ISAC, information sharing and analysis centers, finance, retail, manufacturing. I just posted the link to the chat channel. Find your ISAC, join the ISAC, talk to your peers, see what they're doing. Or if you want, drop a lot of money and Gartner will come and tell you.
Great. Next question. Is there a handy one-pager visual that ties the essential themes of 3 of these courses for an elevator pitch?
I think that leading slide with a triad on it is a good representation of that elevator pitch and to put the appropriate context to it in your organization. If we could go back and show that one, Laura.
Yes, and I will say we have a blog about the triad, and after this is over, I will go into the blog and make sure there is a downloadable version of the slide and some content around it. So check out the SANS blog for the triad blog, and I will add that to it. Thank you very much.
No, Laura, I think this is a great idea, though. I think afterwards we should come together and just come up with a, a cheat sheet with a column, what's the differences of each and things like that. I think it's a really good idea.
Perfect. We will work on that. Next question. How do you ensure that you don't get stuck with one area, for example, vulnerability management or security awareness, due to operational needs while you're trying to mature the entire program?
One recommendation I give to those who have taken 512 is to start looking at metrics. And I know Joe talked a lot about metrics in 514, but you might get pulled into vulnerability management. And all of a sudden, for 1 week in particular, you might be working on that for 40 hours. I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but is that the right amount of time spent on it? And it goes back to what I talked about a little earlier. It depends, right? But are you making any type of material change as well? And one great way that I've been able to showcase change within not only Management 512, but also in my day-to-day is really focusing in on those metrics and figuring out either if it's a metric that you create or you embed what some of your functional areas are into existing metrics decks, maybe like the risk group or maybe operations. You might find that you get the right audience and a little bit more movement on the way as well.
I'll follow that up with metrics. I totally agree with what Kevin said. If you take these one-off approaches or these one-off incidents that you find and go, hey, we've got this problem or this problem or this problem, it doesn't carry much weight. When you put that, accumulate that in metrics and you show the impact, all of a sudden it carries a lot of weight when you put the context to it, and it has a better chance of getting the change that you need.
Great. Will fair quantitative risk assessment be the primary message conduit to the business on the ROI of a security program? Rekt casino example.
I love that question because I also am going to answer it with it depends, right? It depends on a little bit of the maturity of the organization. So in Rekt's case, right, there's a really high possibility that they're probably not ready for the FAIR model. And just for everyone's awareness, the FAIR model is adding a quantitative way of assessing risk within an organization. But in order for that to be successful, there's a few variables that need to be put into place. And one of them is somebody needs to know how to run with that FAIR model, number one. And then number two, it should match the rest of the risk communication and language within the organization. So it's a great way to drive change. It's something that you would want to do, not just within your own group, but integrate the rest of the enterprise risk management group as well. And we go through some great examples in 512 of how it's been a very, very successful rollout. It just has to be planned, has to be thoughtful, and it has to be something that the rest of the team is ready and able to work with.
I'll add to that. I was kind of in that situation. I was CISO at a bank. What's the ROI for security? In the management 514, we talk about security. The value is better viewed as what's not lost. So if you look at the Verizon data breach report, they take a log scale approach to showing you the cost per record lost. If you take that amount, depending on the amount of records you have in your organization, for example, what I did was I got with our risk department at the bank. I said, how many records do we have that could be exposed and breached? And they gave me that number. Then I looked up that number in that log scale approach to cost per record lost, and I got that amount multiplied. So when we stop a ransomware or stop a phishing email, I presented that to the CEO and I said, look, here's what we saved. Here's what we prevented losing by the technical administrative controls we have in place. And he goes, I agree, that's a good approach to this, and that makes sense. And that's how I showed the value that security brings by what's not lost as opposed to return on investment. When you get to that maturity level for FAIR, you can kind of, make that transition that Kevin was talking about.
Wonderful. Next question. I can see how the content in each course complements the others, but where do I start?
Can I answer with it depends?
It does.
Yeah, no, I'll answer, and I'm really interested in hearing Joe and Lance's answer as well. It really does depend. What is your priority right now? Are you looking to build up something that's a little bit more strategic and potentially have a team to implement it? Are you looking to implement what could have already been defined? Are you looking on building upon what was already operationalized and also defined? I will say and I said it a little bit earlier too, those who have taken 512, a lot of them did come from 514 as well and vice versa. And they really take on a lot of different aspects from 512 and 514 to make it not only strategic, like Joe said, operational, and then finally moving it over to something that's really going to change that culture of 521.
The big thing I'd emphasize is it's not tiered. It's not like one class builds on the other. They all interact and partner. So just to follow up with Kevin, pick whichever one you're probably the most interested in, or you think you're going to get the greatest ROI based on where you are now. So they're not tiered, they're interconnected.
Absolutely. I agree with what Kevin and Lance said. In my particular position, I started out with SEC 504 or SEC 504, then went to management 514. Why is that? Because I was all of a sudden presented with the opportunity to be into the CISO role. And I'm like, well, what's going to benefit me the most? 512, 521, or 514? The organization I was in, 514 made the most sense. So I went that way. 512 came along afterwards, and 521 is down the road.
Wonderful. Is there an overarching certification or credential for this transformational cybersecurity leadership triad? And I know the answer if you guys don't.
Hopefully.
We are working on it. So 514 and 512 both have GX certifications as part of the courses. Management 521 is going to be adding a certification, hopefully by the later part of this year. And once we have that certification in place, we are going to be creating a transformational cybersecurity leadership coin. So if you have completed all 3 courses and all 3 certifications, you will have earned the transformational cybersecurity leader coin.
Wow, that's exciting. That's awesome.
All right, one more question, which is a perfect segue for us. I see a March Rekt hack series. Is it the same material as the February series? And I will go back to our slide deck, I think. Let's see. Can you see my slide deck?
Yes, it's yeah. There you go.
All right. So Lance, were you going to cover this or shall I talk about this one?
I believe that one is yours.
All right.
'Cause, yeah, I'm not involved in any of those 3 classes.
So the March series is going to be covering the Operational Cybersecurity Executive Triad. This is another group of 3 of our courses: Management 516, Managing Security Vulnerabilities in Enterprise and Cloud; Security 566, Implementing and Auditing the Critical Security Controls; and Management 551, Building and Leading Security Operations Centers. That Rekt series is going to cover the exact same history of the Rekt casino hack, but from these different perspectives of vulnerability management, critical security controls, and the SOC. And that will also pull together at the end with a panel discussion about how operationally these courses all come together for a triad. And with that, we don't have any other questions at this time. So Joe, Kevin, or Lance, would you like to wrap up with anything?
I'm good.
I'm good.
All right, wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for joining us today, and we hope to see you in the March series as well.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.